Welcome to Too Late Who Gives a Shit, a show focused on answering the most answered questions in gaming history. There's no safer statement than Star Fox Zero was a disappointment, and if there is, it's the Wii U was a flop. And for some reason, everyone on YouTube decided to do a Wii U video while I was working on this, so it may be the most spectacularly redundant video on the internet. But there is still one thing that interests me about Star Fox Zero, and that is that you can't really review it without reviewing the Wii U itself. The game was so tied to the hardware and its struggle for relevance that it's almost as if it spontaneously congealed within its disk drive. In the same way the Lord sent his only son to Earth, lo, Star Fox Zero was begotten from Wii U. Hark! So with the new console generation still struggling to get off the ground, and Nintendo's next hardware release growing closer, maybe it's not such a waste to sift through the Wii U's ashes for a lesson. According to Nintendo, the Wii U began as an extension of Wii Connect 24. You might remember Wii Connect 24 as nothing, because it basically just lit up the system when there was an update. They wanted a second screen that could quickly show what the system was doing without having to boot up the TV. It's a very bizarre thing to design a system around, especially considering that the Wii U was too slow, doubly so at launch, to outpace an average TV and deliver any of the conveniences they were talking about. There had to be more to it than that.
Is it even possible to deliver something for everyone?
The success of the Wii was driven by filthy casual gamers, a demographic Nintendo didn't have much information on. It wasn't clear if these people would stick around to buy a second system or not. Nintendo had hoped that they would transition to playing hardcore games as the generation went on, but there were many signs that wasn't happening. Wii sales peaked relatively early, and it seemed more and more like the success was a fad rather than a permanent shift in gaming demographics. Miyamoto would later call casual gamers pathetic, and while it's debatable whether he meant to sound that harsh in his native Japanese, it's clear that Nintendo was frustrated by their lack of progress with the demographic. They obviously still wanted to try to hold on to some of that Wii success, but rather than putting all their eggs in the casual basket, they decided to reach out to hardcore gamers as a safety net. This meant walking back a lot of what the Wii had been about.
We hear you. You want to play things and things to look like they always have. You want comfortable, and you want surprise.
The Wii Remote was a deal breaker for this crowd, so they had to go back to standard dual analog to appease them and third parties. That decision was likely easier to make considering the partial failure of motion to take hold. The Wii Remote was intended to have a gyro sensor at the start, but it was too expensive to include. So, by Nintendo's own admission, its accelerometers mainly just let the system know if you were shaking it or not. Wii Sports made clever enough use of this to feel novel, but traditional single-player games struggled to do anything with it other than waggle. The pointless shaking of the remote to do the exact same action a button could do. I've talked before about how much damage this type of motion did to the perception of the technology in general. Suffice to say that most gamers were not impressed. The infrared camera was the most substantial innovation the Wii Remote launched with, and it mostly went unappreciated by the hardcore gamers that would have benefited from it the most. By the time Nintendo added gyro with the Motion Plus accessory, it was too little too late. They dumped it out without consulting third-party developers, many of whom were developing games that would have massively benefited from the hardware. LucasArts was making a lightsaber fighter, and was reportedly deeply upset that Nintendo didn't bother letting them know that there was an accessory coming that could have made their game 10 times better. Third parties had a hard time selling anything hardcore-oriented on the system anyway, and Ubisoft was one of the very few to attempt to launch a serious game using the new remote. All their effort and research into motion ended up being a loss. Even Nintendo didn't do much with the new remote, with Wii Sports Resort and Skyward Sword being the only two high-profile games for it, and the sword play in the latter was extremely polarizing. So dual analog it was then. But Nintendo's new Blue Ocean approach depended on innovation. The lesson they learned from the GameCube was that it wasn't enough to just make a good system with good games on it. They had to capture your attention by doing something different, and in the Wii's case that was all done on the controller. How could they repeat that with dual analog?
Welcome to the world of Wii U.
On paper, in a boardroom, putting a touchscreen in must have seemed like a clever solution. It let them have a standard control layout while still adding a feature that set them apart from competitors, and a feature that Nintendo already had ample experience with on their handhelds. But when it was revealed to the public, I think most people wondered the same thing. What's the point? Nintendo didn't have, and never found, an answer to that question. Their announcement sizzle reel had a lot of small throwaway ideas, but nothing that seemed as substantial as what the Wii Remote offered. This moment in particular stood out as a bad omen. Last gen's controller is doing all the interesting stuff, while the expensive new tablet displays a golf ball. What kind of idiot would be impressed by—
golf balls in the sand.
They didn't show the console itself at the reveal, because they knew the moment people started talking about specs, they would be fighting a losing battle. A standalone gamepad hovered around $120, which was almost as expensive as using a DS Lite as the controller. Obviously, that didn't leave much budget for the console hardware. There was endless debate about the Wii U's power, but I think it's settled that the CPU was worse than the 7th gen consoles. An anonymous developer told Eurogamer how Nintendo blew off his studio's concerns that the Wii U's processor wouldn't be able to keep up with the 360's. A developer of Warriors Orochi 3 publicly confirmed the same, that the CPU was not capable of matching Microsoft's 7-year-old hardware. 7 years is an eternity in the tech world. To fail to outperform the 360 in any way after that long was an embarrassment, and the Wii U wasn't even competing with the 360. It launched in the same window as the Xbox One and PS4. Based on their interviews, Nintendo had a very bizarre concept of power that seemed limited to a binary option. Either it's HD or it's not. We're HD now, so that problem is solved. The hardcore gamers who had been mocking their underpowered hardware for 6 years, the very ones Nintendo was trying to appeal to, did not agree. Game after game struggled to perform on the system, and outlets like Digital Foundry often declared the Wii U versions the very worst to play. The system did have advantages when it came to the RAM and GPU, but it never seemed to be enough for visible improvements. But the poor frame rates were very easy to notice. So this was the pitch Nintendo was making to hardcore gamers. Buy a bunch of full-price games you've already played and our $350 system that will run them worse than the box you bought last gen.
Batman is the same game that was released last
It's not
year.
the same
Well,
game.
the same content at least, a different
It's
way to
not the same
experience it.
content.
It's being enough for
Gamepad?
fans to replay these games like a Mass Effect or a Batman?
Absolutely.
Okay,
And,
I mean,
you
that's
know,
a lot of money to spend $60 to replay a game.
Well, you know what?
Jeff Keighley was exactly right. Not even Reggie could spin his way out of it. Hardcore gamers had no reason to buy this, and they didn't. As terrible as their pitch to hardcore gamers was, at least I can see some kind of pitch was made. I don't know why casual gamers were supposed to be enticed by the system. If you're watching this, then you're a Class 5 Platinum Game Master with probably a big dick, but put yourself in the crocs of a casual gamer and let's return to the golf ball demo for a second. You're seeing Wii Sports played with the Wii Remote, and there's no new console in sight. You might understandably assume that, oh, this is a $350 tablet that connects to the Wii, which is something that only an idiot would want.
You add it to your Wii, or you don't even need to use the Wii. Do you need to use the Wii?
Another major pillar of the Wii U is supposed to be its convenience for consuming content.
Nintendo TV was the next logical step for us.
Nintendo, like Microsoft, saw the number of people using their console for streaming and decided to make TV a major part of their next platform. Remember it? Nintendo TV? It didn't last very long, and while the gamepad was a convenient thing to have in the living room, it was rendered mostly obsolete by the rise of tablets that could do basically all of it better. Nintendo acknowledged both their lack of emphasis on the console at the reveal and the growth of tablets as major factors in the system's failure. So they completely blew it with both the casual and the hardcore audiences. That left nerds like me as their only demographic, the longtime fans that would buy, as Michael Pachter put it, a cardboard box if it played Mario. It was kind of a hurtful statement that unfairly— oh, for fuck's sake. I'm done doing this! And if you were a devoted Nintendo fan, then you may have liked the Wii Remote features they were now killing off. Games that were designed for sticks were completely transformed by the remote, and the games themselves barely had to be altered. IR aiming is better, so just patching it in is enough to elevate the game. This is the kind of innovation that I think most people want, the kind that lets us do the stuff we already do, but in a better way. Every second of Metroid Prime was better with the remote, because you could both aim and turn more fluidly. What would the Wii U gamepad offer that could make up for the loss of that feature? A lot of people speculated that it might work as a scan visor you could hold up, but a number of games tried that and the novelty wore off after a few minutes. Then it just became annoying. Zelda is another example. No matter what you think of the final product, I think most people understand the appeal of swinging a sword with your own movements. There was a new type of combat that was enabled by the remote, and playing Red Steel 2 made me think that there was an entirely new frontier for games to explore now. What could the gamepad do to make up for the loss of that? Display a map or inventory screen? This was a common use of the pad for a lot of games, and while it was definitely convenient, it's still fairly easy to just pause the game to do these things. If touch inventory comes at the cost of hardware so underpowered that it slows to a crawl every time I fire a cannon, I'd probably rather just pause the game. New Super Mario Bros. Allowed the gamepad to create platforms that could help another player clear a level, which is another feature that falls into the moderately neat category. 3D World plopped a few tappable blocks in, as if to say, look, we used the gamepad. It has been used. These gimmicks were pretty easily converted for use without a touchscreen in the Switch port. In fact, most Wii U games were easily ported to Switch. The second screen obviously wasn't integral to anything. Yeah, I pronounced it integral. It's acceptable. And if you've got a problem with that, I will fight you in the comment section, you cowards! The gamepad consistently being less innovative and disruptive than the remote could have been a deliberate choice to broaden the appeal of the controller and make it easier for third parties to support. But I don't think the blue ocean strategy works when you have subtle innovations that won't turn any heads. Especially not when those small niceties need a wildly expensive controller. The Wii Remote and Nunchuck offered bigger leaps at the standard $60 price. The gamepad was like a bad interpretation of lateral thinking using withered technology, where the hardware was simple but managed to be impractical and expensive anyway. The most popular feature of the gamepad was off-TV play, and while it was a great convenience, it was also heavily limited. The image had to be streamed over Wi-Fi and the signal degraded rapidly over a distance, limiting most people to the same room as the system or maybe the very next room. The 480p image was also very compressed and clearly inferior to playing on a decent TV. For those without a television or limited access to one, the flexibility offered by the Wii U could be a godsend. Some people also just prefer the handheld experience to a TV, image quality be damned. But for those who had a TV available and wanted the best possible experience, the gamepad was often a useless boat anchor. Off-TV play alone obviously wasn't enough to get people interested. The controller had to do something for traditional TV play. Third parties arguably used the pad as well or better than Nintendo. Zombie U took one of the drawbacks of the second screen and turned it into a gameplay mechanic, using your distraction while looking down to make you vulnerable. But this isn't really innovation so much as it is a sidestep or a one-off novelty. Wonderful 101 used the gamepad as an interior view when entering a building or spaceship, which again was more of a cute novelty than anything else, and it was easily handled without the gamepad by picture-in-picture. Drawing shapes on the analog stick is not only possible but arguably faster than doing it with touch. Mario Maker was a great use of the pad, but it wasn't exactly a game as much as it was a tool. The gamepad could be useful when something was specifically designed around it, or for scattered minigame concepts, but the more traditional a game was, the harder it seemed to find a purpose for it. Splatoon used the screen for jumping to teammates, which was handy but also somewhat easily replaced with the D-pad in the sequel. The better use was providing a minigame to play while matchmaking, something that could also be done with picture-in-picture. And no, I'm not including gyro aim since that predates the Wii U. Pikmin 3 played best with the Wii Remote, while the gamepad just sat there aside from an occasional Go Here command. It's the golf ball thing all over again. Nintendo updated the game to bolster the gamepad's usefulness and ended up with a gamepad-only scheme that still isn't as good as the Remote in my opinion. Smash Bros. Deliberately avoided giving the gamepad any advantage over other controllers, and didn't even allow the touchscreen to work in the menus. Retro didn't bother using the gamepad for a damned thing, not even a picture of a banana. They could have done something terrible, like forcing you to look at the pad to see incoming waves in a level like this, but no. They recognized it had no value for a platformer and didn't even deign to waste system resources streaming anything at all, and it was sadly one of the best uses of the pad all generation. The final snub came from the Breath of the Wild staff, who had to convert the game to work without touch on the Switch. The D-pad solution they came up with in the final game worked so well they replaced the Wii U controls with it also, believing it to be faster and preferable to the distraction of looking between two screens. Valve and Sony also experimented with touchscreen controllers that generation, and both cited that distraction as a reason they nixed the feature. But to hear Nintendo's own staff echoing that sentiment felt like a turning point. Even they had turned their backs on it. Among growing calls for Nintendo to release a cheaper Pro bundle and just put the gamepad out of its misery, they decided to move in the other direction and double down on the second screen. Miyamoto promised that Nintendo would start developing games that would show off what the pad could do, but I think most reasonable people understood that it was over. When you're only getting around to using the controller you designed the system around years after launching it, it's a pretty vain gesture. E3 2014 revealed the fruit of Miyamoto's labor: more gimmicky novelties. Giant Robot failed to materialize into anything, and Project Guard ended up as an add-on to Star Fox Zero. It all fell on Star Fox then, and boy did it fall hard. Flattened the little guy out. In a lot of ways, Star Fox Zero was just the game fans had been asking for, but in a twisted monkey paw wish kind of way. It was a return to Star Fox 64, but it was exactly Star Fox 64, with the same levels and story. I think most of us wanted all new worlds using the same gameplay style, not a Force Awakens type do-over. It was being co-developed with Platinum, who were experts in making intense, replayable action games.
That's good.
But they were handcuffed into showing the gamepad first and foremost, with the game itself being a secondary concern.
Ooh, that's bad.
It wasn't enough to have gyro aim. Every feature of the gamepad had to be used. This led to the game's infamous control scheme, which tends to overshadow talk about the actual game itself. So let's set the gamepad aside for a second and focus on Star Fox Zero, the game. This is a level in Zero. It is very boring. I remembered the asteroid field in 64 being fun, and after revisiting the game, yes, it is still fun. Zero just doesn't have as much imagination. I'm going to bring Sin and Punishment 2 up a lot from here because it's everything Star Fox Zero should have been. Its levels were incredibly dynamic, disorienting, and made the simple rail-style levels of Star Fox 64 seem a little quaint and dated. And in terms of creativity, Zero was a pretty big step down from those. I don't think a single mission lives up to its 64 counterpart, and the quality drop-off is often painfully stark. I remembered this boss being fun, and yes, he is still fun. He's got weak points, and you shoot him with lasers until he dies. The whole affair takes 30 seconds. Star Fox Zero stretches the fight out by making his weak points so time-consuming to get a clear shot at that I realized I was having more fun shooting random debris while waiting around than I was fighting him. A lot of these bosses were already remakes in 64, and I think even the SNES versions are more enjoyable than Zero's. They really should have been more original, because it does the game no favors that there's a better version of pretty much everything in it to directly compare against. Branching paths were part of the fun of 64 and a major incentive to do replays. Zero's map suggests at a glance that it has more going on, but it really doesn't. This isn't the same level I showed earlier. It's a different mission, with the difference being that they tacked on the boss from another level at the end. This is blatant padding. The game wasn't intended to have branching, and they scrambled to add that content in the short time that they had. 64 often had clever conditions for finding one level exit or the other, but here things are often simply locked until you've obtained a ship upgrade. At one point, Starwolf members appear in old levels, and locking onto them will lead to a mini-battle. Fighting Starwolf was always a treat in the older games, but here it's run into the ground with dogfight after dogfight serving as filler. No more of this, please. Any of this is better than stumbling onto another Gyro Wing level, though. Someone at either Nintendo or Platinum had the idea to take Star Fox, but make it very slow, and to give you lasers that harmlessly reflect off enemies, and to make everything revolve around a robot that barely has enough cable to reach anything. One might assume these missions would be more fun using an R-Wing on the second pass, but somehow speed running through these awful little spaces with a vehicle they weren't designed for just makes everything worse. Kill me! Kill me now, goddammit! I'm completely confident that even if Star Fox Zero had perfect controls that everybody loved, it would still be a disappointing shadow of the classic games. The fact that the controls are a nightmare warps it into a completely different dimension of shit. The right analog stick might be the single worst part of Zero. The rest of the scheme clicks more over time, but using a stick to roll and bank never feels right. In heated moments, I couldn't reliably get the double tap to work and gave up on barrel rolling altogether. The signature move of Star Fox, not worth doing. I did get very, very good at doing these moves when I didn't want to, though. It seems like the sticks always happen to align in a U-turn right when there's a wall to fly into. I wanted to see if I could unfuck the piloting, so I dumped the game to Cemu and remapped everything as the SNES game did, with banking on the triggers. It's kind of stunning just how much better everything immediately is. Barrel rolling is simple and reliable, and I could also make the swap screen button more accessible. Playing this way made me realize how much of a failure the Wii U scheme was at every level, where even the most basic actions felt worse than they needed to, and where the game arguably plays better without the second screen it was built around. The one thing that emulation still can't fix is the targeting. I'm a huge proponent of gyro aim, but only when it's used in conjunction with a stick or trackpad. The sensor loses calibration with movement, and most gyro controllers are two-handed devices that you don't want to lift any more than necessary. Ideally, the gyro should only be used in this area of the screen, with bigger movements done on the stick. Having to move the cursor all over the screen with a jumbo gamepad casts gyro aim in the worst possible light by bringing all its faults to the fore. The Wii Remote was far better for motion-only aiming. The cursor can move as aggressively as you want it to with no calibration loss, and it's more comfortable because the movement comes from tilting your wrist rather than lifting a two-handed controller. The pointing action also makes aiming more intuitive, since you can point towards the edge of the screen and know that your cursor will end up in about the same place. Like Star Fox Zero, Sin and Punishment separates aiming and flying controls, but here there's no learning curve. Maybe it's the complete separation of these actions into different hands that makes the difference, but it feels natural from the moment you start, and the cursor works. A common defense of Zero is that it wasn't possible to have a good cursor because of the decoupled aiming, but it can and does work here. The only problem is that the game can get confused about what depth the cursor is supposed to be targeting, but that's mainly an issue when side-scrolling in 2.5D, which Star Fox doesn't really do. And it's mostly a cosmetic issue, since the cursor will always correctly target the enemy it's placed over regardless of depth. Your character will just animate weird while figuring it out. So why didn't we get Star Fox on the Wii, when it could have worked so much better? Miyamoto said it was because they had no ideas, which really seems like they just didn't want to make it. Because how else do you look at this system with God's gift to rail shooters, and the capability for levels like this, and fail to see any potential? And they're clearly not averse to doing iterative sequels, going by the 4 copied and pasted new Super Mario Bros. Games in a row. This was never about doing justice to Star Fox. It started as random gamepad experiments unrelated to the series, which they then tacked the Star Fox IP onto, which is pretty on brand for the series at this point. So instead of a potentially perfect Star Fox on the Wii, we got this. I think it's fair to hold that grudge against Zero because the Wii U supported the remote. They still could have done a Sin and Punishment style game. In fact, Zero itself supported the remote, but only for piloting the ship in co-op mode, not shooting. I guess this last-ditch effort to redeem the gamepad wouldn't have looked great if the remote once again came along and rendered the tablet obsolete. On the plus side, the game does seem more fun with 2 players splitting the tasks. When solo, trying to aim in the classic TV view makes you feel about as accurate as Liza Minnelli after a round of Dizzy Bat.
Seem to be pulling some serious cheese.
So you basically have to use the gamepad to shoot, and while targeting you have a poor sense of what obstacles your ship can clear. So at any given moment you're either experiencing the worst aiming or the worst flying this genre has to offer. It would seem natural for each section to be weighted towards only one of those actions at a time, so you could intuitively sense which screen to use, but they constantly mix flying and shooting to the point that no matter which view you choose, it feels like you're looking at the wrong one. Because this remains a score attack game where shooting enemies is everything, I gravitated to the targeting view more and more as I played. As far as I'm concerned, this is a first-person Star Fox game, which isn't a very fun thing. Star Fox 64 demonstrated that back in the 90s. The TV gets even less useful in boss fights by locking onto the enemy and only providing a side view, or by randomly swinging the camera every which way. I thought the TV was for piloting. Now I can't even see what's 5 feet in front of my ship? In areas where there are obstacles to crash into? According to the best defense of this mechanic I've read, you just have to use the gamepad view to scout out what's ahead of your ship while also shooting. Duh. So now you're using the small, low-res gamepad screen to both target the enemy and intermittently swing your view around to make sure you aren't flying into a building. It's like they tried to make this as shitty to play as circumstances could possibly permit. Using the swap screen button is an overlooked way to improve the targeting view, but it still doesn't explain why having 2 screens is better than 1 in the first place. Why is splitting my attention in this way better than being able to competently shoot and fly at the same time? Being able to shoot enemies that aren't on the TV is a plus, but that's not something that really matters for Star Fox gameplay unless you go out of the way to force it in. They had to invent enemy types that need to be bombarded in order for this to be useful. The classic approach is that you shoot the enemies while they're on screen, and if you miss, you miss. You play the level again and do better. That's kind of the whole point. Being able to snag a missed enemy isn't worth making the controls so awkward that they become the reason you miss in the first place. The game mostly forces the dual screens as yet another gimmick, another novelty. You have to keep an eye on the TV to watch for a lot of energy shields, which will consume your ship if you get too invested in shooting. Some of these pulse so quickly that you can only get a few shots off before having to fly away again. This is fun, right? Fun enough to end the game on? Zero certainly seems to think so. Switching is the lifeblood of it. Switching screens, switching to robots, switching vehicle modes, switching between weak points. Whatever you're doing, stop doing it, because it's time to do this other thing. Some of this can be traced back to Star Fox 2, whose DNA was absorbed by this project, but it's pushed to an obnoxious level in Zero, and almost all of it is in the service of trying to somehow, some way, make you interact with the gamepad.
You can trust your view from the cockpit, Fox.
Yes, it's no longer
trust your instinct.
It's trust in the bullshit mechanic we wedged in to get you to look at the pad one last time after a whole game of forcing you to look at the pad. There is a fanbase for this game that claims that the controls are great and that it was misunderstood by incompetent players. In that way, it has some parallels with Resident Evil 6, but while revisiting that game made me respect it at least a little more, the deeper I go into Star Fox Zero, the worse I think it is. I want to at least acknowledge that, yes, this works for some people. And after seeing so many gamers fail to give motion aiming a fair chance, the last thing I want to do is close my mind to a new control style. But Star Fox Zero isn't worth the effort. By the time you get comfortable with the controls, you'll probably have beaten the game once or twice already, and these missions aren't worth playing any further than that. Unlike Gyro Aim, you don't have an entire generation of titles to play using these new skills. Just this one short, mediocre game that nothing will ever play like again. Sin and Punishment 2 only has 7 levels with no branching, but they can be up to 20 minutes long, and the intensity of the gameplay makes it seem fuller than the numbers suggest. Some of the bosses are so massive that they have multiple checkpoints, and even the mini-bosses you fight on the way to bosses are better than anything in Zero. And again, all of it is fun from the start. This is the difference between a developer being inspired to make a game, and a developer rushing to support a hardware feature out of pure obligation. I don't really have any forgiveness for Zero, because it's the very worst kind of Nintendo game. The kind that masquerades as innovation while in reality stifling it. Because every time that people say that gyro aiming is bullshit or that new control methods are a gimmick, they're talking about things like this. And they're right in this case. All the good done to advance motion by other games can get wiped out by one Star Fox Zero. I think the main lesson from the Wii U is that while innovation is important, it also has to have a clear and practical application for what games are doing right now. Even in failure, I appreciate that Nintendo tried something different, but you can't force a vague new type of play that no one was asking for and that doesn't address any current problems. The Wii Remote addressed a problem, that joysticks weren't as good for aiming as a mouse. The Wii U gamepad mostly just invented new problems, and in the case of Zero, an entire game to serve as a vehicle for them. It does seem that Nintendo has made the right move since then. The Switch found success by leveraging something no other company had, a healthy handheld line. All of the convenience of off-TV play is here, but with much better quality and total portability. And for extra insult, the Switch does it in a sleeker form factor despite having all of the system hardware inside of it. The only Wii U feature it doesn't render obsolete is dual screenplay, which was clearly not that important. The split Joy-Cons also allow games like ARMS and Skyward Sword to revive one-to-one motion again. The Switch can do just about everything from Nintendo's past aside from IR aiming and bongos. Its hybrid approach has obvious appeal, and it's not likely that any other company could have successfully executed the idea. Nvidia, the very provider of its processor, had just failed to do it. The Switch checks all the boxes, but in the right way this time. While things have been amended on the console side, Star Fox is still in a bad place. I would hope Nintendo was able to recognize that the failure was the Wii U's, not Star Fox's, but a major flop for any reason tends to disappear a series for a while. Miyamoto also showed no interest in doing a straightforward new Star Fox in the years prior to Zero, so the odds of getting something that controls like 64 3D again may not be great. It's anyone's guess what kind of horrid concept they'll have to tack the Star Fox IP onto before we get another game. What I do know is that anyone hoping for a new Star Fox should bide their time by playing Sin and Punishment 2 instead. Nintendo should go back to study it. It's better than even a good Star Fox game on the Wii was likely to have been. Because it has swords. This is now a review of that game, and I give it 10 out of 10 tingles. Pick it up at the nearest electronics boutique, and forget about that nasty old fox.
Good work, Star Fox.
Nanda yo, omae, jibun dake.